saying basic. Oh, thank you. Let me start over. Hi, everybody. My name is Godfrey Plata. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the deputy director at LA Forward Institute. We are a nonprofit that works to ensure that we reach democracy here in LA County by getting residents the knowledge, skills, and relationships they need to be able to partake in their local government and ensure that their lived experiences are advancing justice across all sorts of different issues. For folks who are just joining us, folks have been introducing themselves in the chat box with their name, pronouns, where they are in LA County, and any questions they may have. And we're collecting those questions for any Q&A time that we've got with the supervisor, who has so kindly agreed to join us today as we learn about her proposal to shake some things up at the county level in terms of governance and representation. A couple of things. Here's what we're going to do today. Again, the spirit of today's conversation is learning together. And so in the spirit of learning together, the first thing we're going to do after this overview is my colleague Allison Henry, who supports our work primarily in the SGV, but also in cities all over Southeast LA as well, through some housing justice education work that she does through Best Start. She's going to ground us in just some basic information about the county. We're going to learn some stuff from Supervisor Horvath about some interventions on county governance. So if things are intervening on county governance, we probably should know about the things they're intervening upon first. So Allison's just going to make sure we all have some basic information about the county. We're not going to spend all of the time there because clearly all of you are here because you want to learn about these proposals that have come down the pipe as well. Actually, my colleague C has prepared links to the actual proposal itself, as well as a fact sheet that Supervisor Horvath's office has provided for anybody who's trying to learn more about what's happening. So she's going to put those in the chat box in a moment for anybody who hasn't seen the actual language of the proposal. In case you're a visual person, you like to scroll through the details. Today, of course, during our teach-in, we're going to be very much at the high level. That's why we're soliciting questions from you all so we can attend to some of the details that you might be interested in more. But just know that the audience that we're trying to teach to today in this teach-in is a very diverse audience in terms of our understanding of county governance. So if you are very steeped in policy nerddom around the county, just know that we might be starting at a different place to ensure that people can catch up with you. So just want to acknowledge that in advance. Supervisor Horvath's office has agreed to do some Q&A, some with me, and then I'm going to moderate questions that have come through the chat box with you all as well. So I really appreciate the curiosity folks are bringing to this as we learn together. We've then invited a couple of respondents to the call who have been processing governance reforms throughout the city and the county. And so we'll introduce them in a bit, but Dr. Guerra from LMU's study of LA, or Center for the Study of LA, is here joining us to just share some thoughts and put some things in context for us, given the expertise he has been building for decades around this particular topic. And we've got Alessandro Negrete from a community organization, Alliance for a Better Community, who is a member of the RLA coalition that's been working on city governance reform. And so a little bit different, but here to share some perspective on, just early thoughts on how this struck him from a perspective of having worked on city stuff. And then we're going to turn things over again to my colleague Allison, who will be doing some fun polls with you all just to get a sense of what you all think and what's exciting to you, what's challenging to you, and all of that. So we just want to get a pulse on who's here, what folks are thinking about, and then we'll close out with some next steps. Today, we hope this is our first conversation about county governance reform. Now that we've got these proposals to respond to, we probably should stay at the table as community members and ensure that we're partaking in conversations from here on out. So this is the first step that we are proposing out of many to come. Anyway, so that's where we're headed. A long intro, but really the last thing that I'll share with you all before I pass things to my colleague, Allison, is the timeline that this proposal is on. So for folks who are keeping track of the news, on July 3rd, so right before the 4th of July holiday, all of this was introduced at a press conference. The agenda was distributed for a board meeting that was on July 9th. On July 9th, the proposals were introduced, and basically the introduction at the board was basically to tell county council to create some language that potentially could appear on the ballot. And so county council is now drafting language that could appear on the ballot that represents these proposals. You'll see that out of our 5 board of supervisors, 3 voted to go ahead and start drafting the language for the ballot this upcoming November. 2 abstained. And then what will happen is the county council will come back with some language. And so between now and August 6th, there'll be opportunities to hear and see the language that county council may be putting on the ballot. And so those are the ways in which the public will be able to keep track of where this is going. And then if on August 6th, which is the final opportunity, if by August 6th, which is the final opportunity that the board will have to approve this ballot language to go on the ballot, if they approve it with 3 out of 5 votes or more, then voters will have the opportunity to vote on these proposals in the upcoming election right in front of us. And so clearly that's not where this ends. Like if this passes on the ballot, then implementation, as you all will hear, is actually many years of implementation of this that will help us change up the county in many ways. So that's where this is going. Again, we're situated right in the middle here. We're just awaiting word on council language is our next opportunity to really learn what's going on. And so with that, I'm going to pass things to my colleague, Allison, to just walk through some basic facts about LA County. And I do want to shout out our RLA partners at AAPI Equity Alliance, who have helped to cull some of this basic information for us. Like credit to them for just like helping us learn the basics. So Allison, passing to you.
Thank you, Godfrey, and good evening, everyone. Allison Henry, she, her pronouns. I live in Pasadena. I'm the San Gabriel Valley lead organizer for LA Forward Institute. Very excited to have you all here. I'm particularly excited because my background is in tenants' rights and organizing. I was one of the authors of Measure H for Pasadena, which was an amendment to our city charter. So it's with great pleasure that I talk with you tonight about sort of LA Government 101, just very quickly. Next slide, please, Godfrey. So just taking a step back and looking at what body are we talking about? Los Angeles County, as we all know or suspect, is very large. It's 88 cities. That sort of dovetails with the work that LA Forward Institute is doing outside of LA City, right? We know that there's a lot of change that can be made at the city level, but we have 88 cities in LA County. It's over 4,000 square miles. We have a really large budget of $39 billion, 11 million residents. And as you'll see against other data stats, we're large in many ways. We are large. There are over 100,000 employees of the county, that's public employees, 34 departments whose heads are, or department heads are appointed by our 5 elected board of supervisors. Next slide, please. So how large is LA County compared to, say, other places in our country? Pretty large. If you're able to see the screen, you'll see the blue states. Those are states that have a smaller population than our county, right? So just want you all to just take that in for a moment, especially as we're coming up on national elections and we're talking about representation. So Los Angeles County is very, very large. That's not necessarily to disparage size, but it's really to provide context, right? Next slide, please, Godfrey. So this is another way to look at our very large county, right? By sort of geographic regions. So basically from the desert to the sea. The stereotypical thing you hear about California, I can go to the mountains and the beach. In a way, you can, this is our county, right? You can go to I think Mount Baldy might technically be in San Bernardino County. I grew up in Claremont, but you can get to the gateway of Mount Baldy when it's not burning. And then you can get to the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. So it's a very large county with a huge populace. And any of you who've been lucky enough to drive from end to end of it, either way, no, it's very large. Next slide, please. Just one last sort of glimpse of LA County, because we've talked about its size and we mentioned 88 cities. What we didn't mention, or what I'd like to highlight here, and this map does it, we have something called unincorporated areas. These are areas whose real sole governance comes from the Board of Supervisors, because you are not in a city or town where you can go to the city council as maybe your first stop for advocacy or comment. And it's a lot of folks. And in fact, I would note that most cities in LA County have some portion of them that are actually unincorporated because of railway lines, transit lines, old holdovers from railroad. And in fact, you should always know that about your city, even if you live in Pasadena, West Covina, Covina, check to see if you're an incorporated or unincorporated. And just quick note, LA Forward is looking to do things for unincorporated advocacy, but stay tuned for that. Anyway, next slide, please, Godfrey. So we have this big area, no matter how you slice it. So how is it governed in terms of, you know, the document or the guiding principle? We have a county charter. That's that's a constitution. Whenever you change the county charter, let's say like in 2020 with Measure J, which was a rethinking of our county budget, you need to do that through voter approval. Those of you who live in incorporated cities that have a charter yourselves, this is also the way you make change in your own cities. The county can also do ordinances, which means the county can create it, the county can modify it, and if need be, the county can sunset it, meaning putting it to bed, it no longer is a law. We saw this a lot, thankfully, during COVID. The county was very proactive and forward thinking, actually, in terms of like housing protections, tenant protections, small business protections, etc. And a lot of those came through ordinances, right? So very important to know how a body can pivot. And lastly, maybe those of you who've watched meetings, you'll hear the word motions. You make a motion, you support a motion, you read a motion. These are merely directives or telling the staff from the County Board of Supervisors what to look into, what to report on, or in some cases, what language to draw up. Next slide, please. So we have 5 elected supervisors, 5 districts. Each district includes about 2 million people, right? And they can be hundreds of miles. If you don't know who your Board of Supervisor is, or your supervisor is, that would be a great thing to know, just very handy to know. But they're also just really powerful. Besides the governor, our U.S. senators, and the LA mayor, the supervisors, the LA County Board of Supervisors, are the next powerful position because of the size of the county. And they have a lot of responsibility. They're in charge of setting county policies, as we've mentioned. They make budget decisions, and they hire and fire department heads, things like public health, etc. And then their board members also serve on other related agencies that have, you know, say over the quality of our life, literally things like our air quality, our transportation quality, our open space quality. And each board member has around 4 or 5 field offices, depending on the Board of Supervisor representative, and they have between 30 and 40 staffers. So one way to think about this is 30 to 40 staffers handled over 2 million people. So just one way to think about it. Next slide, please, Godfrey. These are our current Board of Supervisors, 5 women, and depending on where you live, one of these individuals represents you, right? And like I said, we've got 5 districts. Like with all districts, they're kind of funky in the way they're drawn, so I would really refer you to a district map. But like I said, we've got 5 members who are quite diverse in various ways of representation. We have some information on them here. I don't want to go too much into this, but 5 very qualified women on our County Board of Supervisors who represent you in some way. Next slide, please. LA County also has a chief executive officer. The current CEO is Phasia Davenport. Right now, the county CEO is not elected, but rather appointed by the Board of Supervisors. The chief executive really handles the day to day, right? And that includes the managing and recommendation of the budget. Again, almost $40 billion day to day over not just hiring and firing, but strategic plans, guidance on new ordinances or new measures. Measure J, for example, takes a lot of infrastructure and implementation from the county. That's basically reallocating our budget 10% for CAREFIR's budget. So lots of things to have under your portfolio. There are some counties that have elected CEOs, chief executive officers, to be publicly accountable around the budgeting process, right? Because this is public money. So just something to think about in terms of an alternative model. Next slide, please, Godfrey. And lastly, so the county, big place, big space. We wanted to just share with you this Venn diagram between a city and a county. For those of us that live in incorporated cities, the city handles many of our day-to-day services, garbage, traffic lights, any kind of implementation of city laws, housing, police budgets if you have your own city police. But there's also a huge overlap with the county. And in fact, I think we found this with COVID. Things like firefighters, animal control, parks, libraries, a lot of the more pooled services. So this slide's really just to let you know what falls under the county domain, what falls under a city's domain, and what are shared responsibilities to think about how do you encounter LA County in your daily life. With that, I want to pass it back to Godfrey, and thanks all for giving me your attention.
Thanks so much, Allison, for that quick, breezy 101 guide to our county. Thank you so much for all of that. Again, just wanted to make sure that folks had some foundation for understanding the county and its work, because now we're going to bring on Chair of the Board of Supervisors. Supervisor Horvath has agreed to join us to help us learn more about her proposal. And so I'm going to stop sharing screen, actually, and I believe my colleague C is going to bring on the supervisor momentarily, and so she will be spotlit so that everybody can see her, and then we'll ask some basic questions to learn more about this. Again, in the chat box, we'll also put in there the links that would be helpful for folks to take a look at the county proposal yourself, the text of it, as well as the fact sheet. So see if Supervisor Horvath can make sure it is easy. There we go. I see you now. We can spotlight her. That would be great. Can you hear us, Supervisor?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I think someone has to. Here, I'll add you to spotlight. Here we go. Bam. All right.
Ooh, all right. Very good.
Great. Thank you for joining us today. We know you're incredibly busy, but we are a curious community, and we're here to learn from you. So if you could, for folks who don't know you, if you could introduce yourself and then tell us sort of what led you to this proposal and what's in it.
Sure. I'm Lindsey Horvath, she, her, hers. I am currently serving as supervisor for the 3rd District as well as chair of the board. Currently, our board has a rotational chair, so it rotates every year, and so I am serving as chair this year. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be able to connect with you and all of the LA Forward members. I am in awe of your great work, and I have seen how stellar you have been in the city process, really advocating for more inclusion, more seats at the table, and expansion of the conversation, and making sure that the diversity of Los Angeles is reflected in the conversation. And I think that's really the goal of this proposal, and more importantly, the outcomes to follow, the process to follow. We have watched how the city of Los Angeles, through your help and your leadership, has been engaged in this conversation about how many seats should be at the table, and what does representation actually look like, and what are improvements that we can make to our local government. And in fact, we as a board had similar conversations starting at the beginning of last year. I co-authored 2 motions with my colleague Supervisor Mitchell, who has been our fearless leader in this space, and we brought forward proposals to talk about to explore what some changes could be for the County Board of Supervisors. Now, while the city of Los Angeles currently has a mayor, which is their elected executive, and their legislative body, which is a city council of 15 people, the Board of Supervisors in Los Angeles County has not changed its governance structure, which is 5 people for about 10 million people, as you indicated. That governance structure has not changed since 1912, before women had the right to vote, before so many of the progressive changes that have happened. And so we believe that change is long overdue in terms of representation, and especially equitable representation in Los Angeles County. Proposals to change the structure have been brought to the voters before. As you indicated, charter amendments have to go to the voters. And in the past, having an elected executive or expanding the Board of Supervisors has gone to the voters before. They've gone in separate proposals at different times and for different reasons. And they haven't passed for a number of reasons that I can get into. But what we are proposing this time is not just separating the powers, or not just expanding the board, but really wrapping all of this in a good governance and ethics proposal going forward. So not only do we have the change that will be, should it get on the ballot in November, not only will we have the change that that is proposed in this ordinance, but we have the infrastructure and opportunity for change going forward. The county has never had a charter commission before, for example. So we really wanted to think through what are those pieces that are critical to change, and how do we create the architecture for a process for change. There's been some discussion around process, and I know that your process has been, has included a thought about a lot of different proposals leading to an eventual outcome. We believe, and we have seen through your process, we don't want to, lead people into a process that doesn't actually lead to change, because I think that creates more public distrust. So what we are proposing instead is the architecture for change, to launch a process in partnership with all of you, so we can all be engaged in how we change and transform our county government to be more responsive to the people. And it includes 3 basic things. First, separating out the executive authority from the legislative authority. It's pretty simple. We've learned this in our civics, that there's an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch of government. But in the county, actually, all 3 of those functions exist in the same board of 5 people. So the same body that is responsible for legislative change is responsible for executive action and implementation, and sometimes functions in a quasi-judicial way. So there's no checks or balance on the elected authority of Los Angeles County. We want to separate that out and have an elected executive. That is the person that drafts your budget. We think that person should be accountable to the public. We also think that that person who is responsible for budget overall management and implementation should be responsive to the public, and separate that authority out from the legislative body. The second change is an expansion of what will be the legislative body, the Board of Supervisors. Currently, there are 5 seats at the table. We're proposing 9, and those 9 seats would coincide with the redistricting process that begins in 2030. And we have a process for implementing how we get to that total of 9 over a period of years. But we want it to coincide, because that's when the process already exists for us to think about what are the districts, how do we think about communities of interest, which are different constituencies that need to be represented and deserve to have equitable representation at the table. There's a process built in every 10 years. We want to work within that process at the next step to expand representation and bring more seats to the table to create more inclusion. And then the third component is ethics and governance reform bodies. So we are proposing an independent ethics commission to take a look at how we hold elected officials accountable and hold us all accountable to what the voters expect. We are proposing a governance reform task force. That body will be charged should this ordinance be passed and approved by the voters. The governance reform task force will be the body that holds public stakeholder meetings and engagement to engage the public in a process going forward of how we implement these changes, because some of the architecture, like I described, will be set by the voters, but the implementation, the how, will be worked on in partnership with the public. We're also proposing a charter reform commission going forward that will meet every 10 years. So we're not waiting more than 100 years to talk about how we should be governing Los Angeles County. This commission will be convened, as I said, at least every 10 years, and it will take a look at how are we making improvements? Do we need to maybe add more seats at the table? Should we look at some of the other things that this board is interested in, things like participatory budgeting and so many other things? And I believe this moment right now is critical. Not only do we have a board of supervisors where all 5 of us in the past year and change have voted to advance some form of governance reform change, but this is also a presidential election year. So we have potentially the highest, typically the highest voter turnout happens in presidential elections. And so we want as many LA County voters at the table with us to engage in this conversation and to vote on whether it's time for change. And I believe, and we have communicated with some of the voters, we've done some research to see that people don't feel the status quo of LA County is serving them well. They want to see more seats at the table, more seats that look like the diversity of Los Angeles County, and they want to have some checks and balances on how this county government does or doesn't work. Because we've seen a lot of changes having to come forward by voters, like you mentioned, Measure J. These things should be coming forward, but it also should be coming forward through our legislative process. And we should see these changes implemented, not just passed by the voters, but actually implemented. And so having that separation of powers will allow us more authority to implement change and more accountability on how we implement change. And we can also make sure that we create opportunity for greater diverse representation at the table. I don't know if I've exceeded my time. I can talk about this for a very long time. Is there any questions?
Yes, so I have a couple of questions from the audience. Although before that, I guess in the spirit of us learning about the county and how we engage with the county, can you share like how would we experience the difference? I guess if like a lot of these things sound like they're internal, they sound like they're things that change the way that governance works, but like just as a resident, like what would the outcome for my life be?
So right now, for example, we've heard a lot of frustration around the budget process. People don't know how to have more of a say in how the county budget is developed and how it gets shaped. It is right now controlled by the CEO, who is appointed by the Board of Supervisors. So this change would allow the person who is in charge of the budget, it would require them to be accountable to the voters. They have to be voted in this new position. Another thing is that you will have the opportunity for more diverse representation at the table. Right now, we only have 5 seats. 5 people represent close to 10 million people. There is no other government like it. We learned from Professor Guerra, Dr. Guerra, that there's no other government like it in the world. And that's not always a good thing. You want to have a check and balance on how your government works so it actually advances proposals. That's something that you will see in this change. You will have the opportunity to participate in how that expansion happens. But you will also have the opportunity to participate in the governance reform process. We will have ongoing public engagement meetings to talk about, how do we restructure the county government? How do we make sure that we use the existing resources? Because this charter amendment also proposes that we work within our existing budget, which is $46 billion. We work within that existing budget to make sure that we use that funding, that existing funding, to make all of these changes happen. One of the reasons this hasn't advanced before is because people have been worried that if you expand the government, it's just going to cost too much money. Well, I think with $46 billion on the table, at least every year, we have the resources we need to expand a modest change from 5 to 9, still not as many as are at the city council level, by the way. But we're making a modest change. We can work within this budget to do it. And we can make sure that that $46 billion budget is accountable to the people. The directors of each department will now have to publicly present their budgets and discuss them with the board in a public forum. And, you know, some of these changes we know could be made by ordinance. As you heard, ordinances are things that we can bring forward as a board. But the reason I believe it needs to be changed by charter is just because you have a board that you trust to make these changes now, you can potentially go back to a board that thinks this kind of transparency isn't a good thing. We need to codify these changes now. We have a board that is interested in accountability and transparency, and I think we should make that the floor and continue to pursue towards more aspirational change and more engagement, and especially more people engaged in how their government works.
Thanks for that, Supervisor Horvath. We have a couple of clarifying questions that people have asked. So like if this goes to the ballot, what is the voter threshold that this needs to pass? Because I know people experience that in different ways in election. What percentage of people need to vote for this in order for this to pass?
50% plus one.
Okay, so 50% plus one, simple majority is what, if this is to move beyond August, if the board is to pass this and put it on the ballot, that's how many voters would need to pass this. And then there are like some clarifying questions just about the county CEO, I think, because this is something that a lot of people don't think about, perhaps because it is not elected and people don't have to think about it. We know that there's about 30 to 40 staffers per supervisor is what we learned earlier. You can tell us if that's true or not. You can tell us how many you have, for example. But what is the size of the county CEO staff? Like, what does that office look like?
So the county CEO staff changes. So I'm not exactly sure of the number that's only dedicated to budget and management. But for example, the way the current CEO office is structured, and I want to be very clear, we are not proposing that this be that the current CEO run for office. That's not what this proposal is. It's the position will be called the county executive, and it will function as counterpoint to the board, much like a mayor does with the city council or the governor does with the legislature. You'll still have somebody who is a subject matter expert. We'll have a director of budget and management who will function sort of like the CEO does now in an appointed capacity, who has that sort of expertise. But the county executive will be an elected position that will be responsive to the public. And so currently the CEO's office houses not only staff that works on budget and management, but like the homelessness initiative, for example, or other initiatives of the Board of Supervisors. Those all exist under the CEO's office instead of as their own departments. That's why there's a lot of confusion often about how departments do or don't work and where authorities begin and end. And so we want to make sure that all of that is clearer so we can move more transparently and more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. And someone was asking similarly about an elected county executive type of person. Like what would I'm going to read this person's question and maybe maybe it'll make something occur to you. But do you have an analysis of how electing a chief executive or a county executive would impact the position's incentives? So like, what would they be like? I guess I'm understanding that as like, what would they be? Who would be incentivized for that? What kinds of incentives would someone have to work within that? I don't know. Like, what's your analysis?
You mean their personal incentives, or what are the incentives to the public? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
I don't know. I'm just reading questions from the from the public as well.
Well, I think one
And
of
so
the incentives of I think one of the incentives of separating out the legislative authority from the executive authority, the legislative body of any government is really supposed to set the policy, and the executive is supposed to be the implementer. And so those two things are supposed to work in partnership, but sometimes there's also a healthy tension. You know, there needs to be a give and a take, and in so doing, there's accountability. Right now, all of those things exist inside one body. So when we think about something like jail closure, for example, the board has given multiple directives on jail closure, and ultimately it is the staff that is implementing it. If there were an elected executive, that elected executive would have the authority to convene and work with the departments and oversee them to make sure that they are actually holding accountable the departments who are supposed to be making that change happen that is directed by the board. Right now, the CEO has authority as appointed by the board, but they don't have more authority than the department directors, because each of the department directors in the county are also appointed by the board. A lot of people think that because she's the CEO, she can maybe hire or fire the department directors. She can't. That's the board's authority. So sometimes, and I've learned in my short time being on the board, that even department directors who are supposed to work together on something like jail closure, if they aren't explicitly told that they have the authority to do something, they assume they don't have it because they believe that they have to be given what in county speak is called delegated authority. They have to be told that they have the authority to actually do something that may be outside their typical lane of operating. And all of that sounds very bureaucratic to me. It might to you as well. But what I have learned is if we don't empower that leader with the authority to make those changes, we get what we've seen: stall after stall on all of these progressive changes that we have wanted to see happen. And so separating out those authorities allows us to have the kind of accountability that everybody, I think, is expecting of the county.
Thank you for that. And I think people are realizing in the chat box that I guess this proposal, our current language around the county involves a CEO. And what this does is actually create a new different position, a county executive. And that is the thing that is elected. Feels like that's like a key understanding that we need to develop around what this is proposing, and that there are some appointed sort of bureaucratic positions that carry out some of the function of the current CEO.
Yeah, the new county executive, the elected executive, the county executive will have their own staff and including the ability to appoint a director of budget and management, and that person will have to be confirmed also by the Board of Supervisors, so everybody's working together. And the county board will have their own person to objectively review policy, sort of like happens at the city council or at the state legislature. So they also have their person. So they will, each body, the executive lane and the legislative lane will have their own people, their inside bureaucrats to work with them on the development and implementation of policy. But you have the reason you elect people is you want people to be accountable to the public. And I think that somebody who's in charge of drafting a $46 billion budget and implementing the policy that is directed for that budget needs to be accountable to the people, not just 5 supervisors.
Thank you. I see that your staff is going through answering people's questions about this county executive in the chat box. So I just want to position your staff to continue answering those. Someone asked about the Metro Board, which right now has positions for the supervisors. Will that also be expanded to account for the new supervisors? Someone's thinking about like the relationship between the current board and the Metro Board.
So state law governs the Metro Board. So what it currently says is that should the number of supervisors change, then the Metro Board would have to, that Metro as an entity would have to engage in a process to determine how the seats that are identified for the supervisors would be filled and chosen. So it's, I know that doesn't sound very clear, but that's what the law provides for. So there are a number of possibilities, and that's why we we're creating a governance reform task force to take a look at it, exactly how that happens. We could simply, it's possible that You could work with the state legislature to expand the Metro Board. It's possible that the seats could be appointed like the city does, where the mayor of Los Angeles gets certain appointees on the Metro Board. The county could do the same thing. It could be something else. There are lots of different options. And rather than my personal opinion being the thing that decides that, we need a public process to engage in what is the right way to do that? What is the best way to do that? And so the governance reform task force will be empowered to hold these public meetings going forward and make recommendations on how we make those changes. Some things, if we codify them by charter, then have to go back to the voters to be changed. Something like that on how we implement, I think should be changed in the law, because if we find that the change that we make doesn't work, we should be able to change that through a legislative process and not have to go back to the voters every time.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask one final question because I know we've got, we also want to have conversation with the folks who are here
Sure.
as well. So thank you for your time as well for being with us for so long. Tell us about like what you need to hear from the public in both like in implementation. It sounds like there's some questions that need to be resolved at multiple levels of government in order to figure out how this would all work. What do you need from the public and organizations that are represented here tonight?
So we absolutely want your participation. Like I said before, there are different kinds of processes. We believe that this is the start of a process and a partnership in how we not only implement this change, this step forward in county governance reform, but how we start working together on a going forward basis. There's going to be a charter review commission that continues this work and looks at all different kinds of questions. So my hope is that we're all reminded we're in charge of this government. And when I say that, I mean not the 5 of us who are the supervisors, but all of us as the people of Los Angeles County have a responsibility to be involved and engaged in how this government works. And I think the proposal that we brought forward is by no means perfect. It does not answer every question out there. It is designed that way on purpose because we need the public to be part of this process. And you all have been at the table with the city. You have done the studies. You've engaged in many conversations. And I want that expertise to come to the county to inform how we propose these changes going forward. We are just coming up with some of the basic architectural changes. And for my part, there's a lot more that I would like to see changed in the county. And I am committed to doing that work. And I know that we have, because of a motion that Supervisor Mitchell authored and I co-authored with her and this board passed, we are engaging in a process to study all different kinds of changes that are possible for county government. But I don't want to miss this moment while everyone's thinking about charter reform in the city, while everyone's thinking about what accountability and transparency in government look like, while we have a presidential election and we're going to turn out, I hope, in record numbers in this election cycle. I want to make sure that every one of those voters turns out and voices whether they're ready to change the status quo, whether they want the county government to take this step forward, whether we want to reclaim our seat at the table and in fact create more seats at the table for people to participate. That's what's really at stake in this moment. And so I would ask for your continued questions and participation. I would ask that you educate people around you that this opportunity exists and that we're honest about it and saying, while this step is not a perfect solution to all of the problems that we have seen in county government, what is ideal is that we're bringing the people back into this conversation. We're bringing all of you back into how county government does its work and reminding ourselves that actually the people have the power. It's not the 5 little queens. The power exists in the people, and you get to decide how you want those of us that you elect to be serving you. And I think this is a step in the right direction. And I hope that we will take this step so we can continue changing the status quo and making a more equitable Los Angeles County.
Thanks so much, Supervisor Horvath. I lied. One final question because people are keeping asking. If this were to pass in November, what are like the first things that what's the timeline like immediately after that? Like what's like the first opportunity the public will have to begin engaging? There's already tons of ideas in the chat box that people want to take up. So what's the first opportunity?
So the very first opportunity actually will be next week. County Council is going to have the ordinance drafted for the board to discuss at next Tuesday's board meeting. So that's the very first opportunity. But what I hear you saying is, should this get on the ballot and pass, then what is the first opportunity? And then, so should we, there will be a first reading, and then there will be a second reading to determine if it goes on the ballot. So that's the process in the short term. Then it will go on the ballot. Should it pass by the voters, the first step will be figuring out how we establish, how we establish the governance reform task force, implementing that change, and getting to work on all of the directives that exist in the ordinance. So first up, we need to create the Ethics Commission no later than 2026. That is the timeline. The county executive would be first elected in the election cycle that is 2028, so 4 years from now. And then the board expansion process coincides with the census and the every 10-year redistricting process. So we've staged out these changes so we can implement them and be ready, and not just kind of have it all change all at once. So we can make some change, stabilize, and continue that progress. So that's the timeline, but we need people engaged now. So don't wait, and don't, just because we know that these changes are staged out, it doesn't mean we don't need you engaged now. In fact, we need you immediately.
Thanks so much again, Supervisor Horvath. And if I could disagree with one thing, I don't think you are 5 little queens at all. You all have a ton of power and things that you bring to the table, a lot of expertise, as my colleague Allison mentioned earlier. So definitely you don't want to minimize everything that you all do and bring for the county of LA. And again, really want to highlight, I really appreciate all the questions and back and forth that's happening in the chat box. I do hope that all of that goes back to you and your staff, because there's like a lot of ideas there that probably will continue on beyond today. I do want to transition to now processing this together with folks who are here. I know we had you for much longer than we had anticipated, so really appreciate you spending your time with us. I want to bring on Dr. Guerra and Alessandro Negrete, just to help us to begin to think, like, what are different ways we can, what are just different things we can react to like about this? And, I'm going to call on each of you one by one. You should probably share a little bit about yourself first, so that people know, like, oh, okay, like what's your involvement in this? But also, like, would love for you all to begin helping us think through just like different angles of what we just heard. Maybe we can start with Dr. Guerra, and if you could share a little bit about yourself, and then share sort of your initial insights.
Fernando Guerra. I am a professor of political science and international relations, and also a professor of Chicano, Chicana, Latina, Latino studies at Loyola Marymount University, where I also direct the Center for the Study of Los Angeles, which conducts a variety of different studies about how people think in Los Angeles, community studies, and then also other aspects. Specifically, I was part of an academic group of myself and 5 other scholars from across LA County that took a look and studied the city reform discussion that occurred last year. And we have a website with a lot of information where we had that discussion. In addition, on a practical level, I was the president of the Electoral Reform Commission for the city of Los Angeles that placed on the ballot moving the elections from odd years to even years, and therefore increasing the number of people who vote in city elections by a factor of 8 and sometimes 10, depending on what type of districts we were talking about. It didn't increase turnout. It just moved elections to where the voters were. Just want to emphasize that. And so I have been now tracking this reform for the last couple of months and seeing what is occurring. I'll stop there and turn it over to Alessandro, and then we can take some questions.
Hi, good afternoon. Good evening, everybody. Alessandro Negrete. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Alliance for a Better Community, a Latino advocacy, policy and advocacy organization, and that does work across LA County. My background includes racial justice across the state, doing work towards advancing immigrant equity and immigrant rights. It's actually great to see Supervisor Horvath again. I saw her over the last week at the Immigration Summit by CCF. Beyond that, I've also been a community organizer that continues to keep my ears and eyes to the ground and understanding the concerns that I bring in where I live in Boyle Heights, but also the county overall through the work that we do at ADC.
Thanks so much, Alessandro. And I just want to really want to emphasize to our audience that is like watching, all we wanted to do is like give us a taste of how differently we can begin to think about what we just heard. And so really want to emphasize to both Dr. Guerra and Alessandro, I know it might be weird to have this conversation while the supervisor's listening. Yeah. She's still here, but would love to think about like different angles of all of this, right? So Dr. Guerra, you know, as someone who has like studied this type of work for quite some time, what's your like assessment of what's happening, like this proposal, like just pros and cons or questions you've got?
Sure. I think one of the major differences between this proposals and proposals we saw in the 60s, 70s, 90s, and 2000s is that it is one initiative that combines both the expansion of the Board of Supervisors and the creation of an elected executive. The previous efforts had two elections, one for the expansion of the board and one for the establishment of a county executive. By the way, they all failed, and they failed for a variety of reasons that we can go into. But I would say that this is a very different electorate that exists in Los Angeles today than even the last time this was up in 2000. And so it's a very different dynamic. I would also say that if you take a look at the motion, there are 13 provisions or directives or aspects to the motion that are outlined, and they're numbered 1 through 13. To simplify it to some of my students, actually just put it into 5 different categories. Provision 1 and 3 is really about establishing the county executive and then really changing what the current CEO office is into more of a CAO office like we have at the city of LA that will be in charge of the budget. So that's provision 1 and 3 about the executive. Provision 2 and 4 are about the expansion of the board and then creating what is known as the Chief Legislative Analyst Office. And that would be a very important department that supports the work of the supervisors now that they are no longer quasi-executives and control the bureaucracy. They need their own independent analysis. The city of Los Angeles has that, the state legislature has that, and Congress has that. And then third, I would put the what I call transparency, and that's Directive 5 and 12 that says that if you have a motion, you have to have it way before we currently do, and departments propose budgets, they have to do it in public. So that's kind of the 2 transparency initiatives. And then you have Directives 6, 7, 8, and 9, which are really ethics reform. And I believe that in an initial motion that was being proposed or thought about, these were all together, but for a variety of different legal reasons that the county council, that is the county attorney, suggested that they be separated out. And then finally, the implementation are Directives 10 and 11, creating further citizen input through a task force and then the establishment of a charter commission. So I know there's a lot there, but just think about executive, empowering the executive, the legislative, the expansion of the supervisors, empowering that group, transparency, ethics reform, and implementation. That's what's in this. I know people will say there's a lot in there, but it really, in a theoretical sense, it's limited to the reforms that I think a lot of the people who are here are supportive. I would also say that one of the things that I really like about the language is that it is general. Either you, Godfrey, or the supervisor mentioned that we need to think about the charter as a constitution. And like most constitutions, they shouldn't be too specific because circumstances change and then you tie the hands of future generations of decision makers. But you do want to have some parameters. And that's what the charter should do, is create the parameters. And I really like the language that it has those parameters, but it's not that prescriptive. And that's a good thing when doing a charter reform. So I'll stop there with my initial thoughts about that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guerra. Alessandro, I'd love to turn with you. You mentioned you're a community organizer, you work with immigrant populations or whatnot. Like, how does any of this land with you? Do you care? To what extent do you care? What do you care about? Just to tell us about your reaction.
Yeah, someone that part of my organizing and policy work that I've done across the state and as well as the county is during Supervisor Molina's time is understanding government. But I think that where, I appreciate the sentiment and I appreciate everything Dr. Guerra mentioned, I think that we have to think about our everyday community member. And I think that, you know, change is often not well received. And I think that change that is rushed is even less well received. And I personally understand, I don't think anyone that's on this call would disagree with saying that the county doesn't need to be reformed. I think it's the presentation and the packaging, and I completely understand everything that was laid out. I understand the phasing, but I think that it's, you know, when you have an election year with a lot of voter apathy, already mistrust in the government, and to present such a huge overtaking, you can explain it, but this is all still in theory. And around how we're going to take all of this. And it's going to take a lot of community advocacy to get the community there. If it does end up on the ballot, it's, you know, for me and what we do at ABC is, how do we get people to really understand? And even when there are going to be opportunities for community to engage with the other supervisors around when the language is presented, that's still during where a lot of our community members are working class that can't be at a county supervisor meeting. So where are we meeting community also where they're at when we're trying to explain a lot of these changes and what this really means?
Thank you so much for that, Alessandro. I want to acknowledge for everybody, we had billed this as 6 to 7. We're clearly at 7, and we're still just getting the discussion started. So I'm going to do some switcheroos. Like here, let me present sort of like what my proposal for this post 7 times, and since we're here and going over, I'd love to pass to my colleague Allison to do some of the public polling of the audience members we have here to get a sense of what people are thinking in this space, because this is a space where we want to honor the fact that there are 70 of you here right now, more than 70 of you here right now, who are developing thoughts around this. And then, you know, after we do that polling for my colleague Allison, which of course is like informal via Zoom, we're not trying to claim it as, you know, scientific polling or anything. After that, we'll share some next steps for this conversation. And folks who are able to stick around, we know Dr. Guerra's here, Alessandro's here, and we can continue some of the conversation for as long as people are available. But I do really want to make sure we uplift the voices that are here and how people here are reacting to it. So Allison, if we could pass to you, and then my colleague C, if you could also re-put in the proposals, just because we heard Dr. Guerra say number 5, number 7, etc. I just want people to know and go to find where those numbers are. Would be really helpful as he's been able to spend time with us. So Allison.
Yeah, thanks, Godfrey. And thank you for all the to all the presenters for the additional information. So I'm going to launch this poll. It's got 5 questions. Just really trying to take a beat on what everyone thinks and just reactions, early reactions, knowing this is a first reaction, as well as just your encounters with the county, LA County. So poll's been launched. I'll give everyone a few minutes to start to answer. Five relatively easy questions. Yeah, we've got so far 62 folks taking the poll. So take your time. We have our own case of voter apathy on our call here. So just give everyone another minute or two so we can get a little bit more participation. There's And again, this was a lot of information for everyone tonight, but we're just trying to get some sort of gut reactions in terms of what's exciting, what's a challenge. This will help anyone with education efforts. And then, do you think this is a good idea? It's a scale of 1 to 5. Question about how often you interact with LA County Board of Supervisors office. Sort of rates of frequency there. And not to be a quiz, but do you know which LA County Board of Supervisors district you live in? Right, with that, I'm hesitant to close the poll because we've got 67% participation. 67%. Okay, just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. As answers keep coming in, oh, who wants to say no to democracy, right? I can still see answers coming in. All right. So I'm going to end the poll for just now. We've got a load of different answers. So I'll go ahead and share the results here. But you're able to see the results. There's a lot of interest in checks and balances. A lot of interest in an elected executive. Lots of excitement about the county just being due for an update. Further expansion. So you all should have access to these polls. Definitely some challenges listed, how quickly the voters can learn about the challenges, more districts creating more gridlock, timeline and the effects, the scale and pace of proposal. But in looking at the scale of 1 to 5, whether or not this seems to be a good idea, 5 being an excellent idea, 0 being not a good idea at all, our answers are falling within the 3, 4, and 5 range, which is on the more positive side. Many of you have interacted with your LA County Board of Supervisors office, not a surprise given some of our friends on the call. And of course, not a surprise, all of you know your supervisor's office. With that, I'm going to stop sharing the poll and pass it back to you, Godfrey. Thank you for everyone who participated in that.
And hopefully this lets folks know that there's just like a wide variety of different entry points that people are taking into this conversation. Certainly here tonight, we had about 80 something folks, about it looked like 39 had taken the actual poll. And so like clearly this is just a pulse, a small pulse of the community that was here tonight. I want to share this screen, knowing that, again, we are theoretically over time, but many of you are still here. And so just want to note for folks who do have to hop that we are planning on continuing this conversation. We hope to have more conversations just about these same types of governance reform proposals. We've reached out to other supervisors as well, and are currently figuring out when Supervisor Holly Mitchell, who Supervisor Horvath had mentioned, might be able to join us for her thoughts about various governance reform proposals that are here, or ones that she's imagining for the future as well. As Supervisor Horvath said, there's much more conversation to come in the years to come. We know in the chat box, I noticed people were asking, why 9? Why 9? And so we're part of a coalition called Our LA that is actually asked to do the modeling for it. Like, what does 9 do demographically for folks? So at some point that's going to be available, and we want to share with you what we learn from that modeling. And so that's stuff that, you know, we're curious about too. One of you pointed out in the chat box that to get beyond to get under 1 million per district would actually have to exceed 9. And so like, what are the pros and cons of that number? I think it's a conversation that many people have had. We want to explore those along those questions alongside you all. So we're going to create spaces in the future. Right now, we don't have any solid dates, but we're looking at a week of the 29th or so. We would love to make sure that we're keeping in touch with this group of folks. We're looking at a couple of other events here at LA Forward Institute as well, just to continue learning about all the different ways we're impacted by a variety of issues across LA County. We are a group that's here to support folks' education around everything happening in our lives. And so this Wednesday, we're having a very similar type of conversation here tonight, but specifically around housing and justice. Like, what are all the different sort of phases of LA becoming LA that have brought us the injustice that we have around housing today. And so we just want to learn together. We're also a community builder as an organization. And so we're really interested in bringing people together to have conversations with other folks who are willing to nerd out like this. And so for our San Fernando Valley folks, we know at multiple times through history, San Fernando Valley has been trying to figure out, should it be a part of LA City or not, or whatnot. We just want to acknowledge that there's many different differences in being part of San Fernando Valley. So we're bringing those folks together for Summer Mixer at Idle Hour, which is in North Hollywood, I believe. For anybody who's familiar with Idle Hour, there's a giant barrel in front of it. So we've confirmed that as of today, and that's where we'll be on July 30th. And then, as Allison mentioned earlier, there's a whole host of Angelenos who are in unincorporated areas of LA County. I believe it's at more than 1 million or so. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing any of our community members together who experience that part of LA County to talk with each other, compare experiences, and if there are ways in which we can support them to bring those experiences to bear on how the county supports them. That's the kind of training and spaces we're here to support. So all of those things are to come. I know, again, I've been acknowledging that we are over time, and there's tons of you still here. Theoretically, this is where we would have ended our conversation. And so I'm going to give folks permission to hop off if this is the end for you. But I also know we still have Dr. Guerra here, whose time was very quickly in sharing with us some of his initial analysis of the proposals. Would love to turn back to you, Dr. Guerra, if there's anything that you might have shared had you a little bit more time. Even though I know like folks are beginning to hop off, but there's still a lot of people here to learn. So Dr. Guerra, what else might you have shared with us about this proposal?
Well, I think number one, in general, not talking about policy, but politics, you're going to see the opposition to these reforms revolve, number one, about it being rushed. And the fact is that this is not rushed. We've been studying county reform for over 40 years. There's going to be the discussion that there needs to be more studies. We have plenty of studies. We can show you them. Parts of them are in that motion. Many of us have been looking at governmental reform for many, many years. Third is going to talk about more politicians, that you're creating more districts, but in fact, you're creating districts that are going to represent fewer people, and that is going to cost too much. Someone mentioned that there are 100,000 employees in the county of Los Angeles. This new reform would not, according to Supervisor Horvath, increase the budget. What they will do is take existing resources and utilize those. One can also say, and I would even suggest if they're going to amend the motion, to say that the Board of Supervisors and all of its staff would not ever exceed 1% of the county employees. That would be more than enough to not only staff the 9 supervisors, but the executive office and the chief legislative office with 1,000 employees, less than 1% of the county's employees. And so the idea that it's going to cost too much can be, I think, addressed in that manner. The other thing that I think Alessandro was talking about, and I think Godfrey, you kind of mentioned it, how will we live? How will we experience this, the difference? How will we materially know that they will make a difference? You can answer this at 2 levels, and the hypothesis would be as follows: that that if this proposal were to pass, you would have separation of powers, increased transparency, ethics reform, and this from a political and policy process would lead to more representation and democracy. In turn, at the second level, then, this greater representation and greater democracy would lead to greater responsiveness that will occur in the area of policy, that is municipal policy, such as services, tree trimming, public safety deployment, sanitation, et cetera. But even in terms of public social services for the beneficiaries, such as foster youth, parolees, indigent, poor, et cetera. And I say this because one of the areas that I have focused a lot of my research on is the increasing representation of previously excluded groups. What do I mean by that? That when African-American, Blacks, Latinos, and Asians are included in representation, we could track policy differences in all kinds of different areas. We have, and I say we, political scientists, about 40 to 50 studies that have asked this very specific question. When you increased representation for previously excluded groups, could we measure the difference? And in the vast majority, 99% of these studies indicated that, in fact, we could measure the difference and that services improved for the previously unrepresented because of the incorporation of previously excluded groups. The data is overwhelming. It is focused, of course, on ethnic minorities, et cetera. Just because we're expanding the board to 9 doesn't mean that it will lead to that, but probably will, as you, I think, mentioned. But increasing representation does make a difference. Rules do matter, and how we structure our government does matter. And I believe that we have the hypothesis to indicate that it will make a difference. And at least in the sliver of research that I'm talking about, we not only have the hypothesis, but we have the data overwhelmingly that changing representation does make a difference.
Thank you so much for those additional thoughts, Dr. Guerra. And again, just want to make sure we underline, first of all, it was not part of our plan to have Dr. Guerra have the last word, but we're very over. He was here. We kind of moved through that part really quickly, so just wanted to make sure we leverage that time while he was here being our guest. Also want to acknowledge there are many more voices that we did not spotlight tonight, like different supervisors, different elected officials, different representatives of the academy or other community organizations. And so it's our commitment to this group to, again, create spaces where we can all learn together and continue to think about this as this plays out, including beyond any sort of voting that happens at the board level, any sort of voting that happens at the county level. Like, now that they've given us sort of like this opportunity to react, we're going to react, and we want to support this group to react. If you need a metaphor, it's kind of like if you open a bottle of wine, it just needs to air out a little bit before you actually dig into it. So we're airing out the wine for the first time. I did get a flag from someone supporting our logistics that we actually do need to close out tonight, so I'm going to close us out here. But again, feel free to reach back out to us at LA Forward Institute if you're excited about exploring this more or keeping track of this. It is our commitment to this group to continue to build spaces like this as well. So really want to thank our guests tonight, the supervisor, of course, but our 2 respondents, Dr. Guerra and Alessandro. Allison and C, shout out to you all as well in helping this work out for LA Forward Institute. For those of you who don't know, we're a very small team, and so it's hard to do rapid response things. And so we're just trying to keep track alongside you all. We aren't expert on any of this, and we just really want to make sure that we're doing our best to bring you all into conversations that we're beginning to get privy to as well. So definitely want to shout out my teammates. We're going to go. Thanks you all, and thanks for joining us. Let's continue to nerd out together. This recording will be made available. I heard that question in the chat box. That's why we recorded it. We want everyone to learn, even if they couldn't make it. So thanks so much, y'all, and have a good night.